Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe Moore coming at you from Breckenridge, Colorado. Today on the show, we have Anne Wagner, PhD, C-Psych, so a clinical psychologist working in Toronto, Canada. Anne is the founder of a small clinic called Remedy, a mental health innovation community, and was one of the investors of cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy for PTSD and MDMA, a MAPS-sponsored trial. She will be leading the MAPS-funded trial of cognitive processing therapy for PTSD and MDMA, and has done extensive work with communities impacted by HIV and collaborates on projects with LGBTQ and HIV/AIDS organizations, and trains and supervises students in evidence-based PTSD treatment and couples therapy, and provides consultation and training to other providers learning these treatments. She is certified as a facilitator of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And this is all from the MAPS integration list. Anne's website at Remedy is remedycenter.ca. It spelled in kind of the UK style, CENTRE.ca. So check that out if you want to learn more. There's a lot of really interesting stuff going there. So yeah, Anne's profile is really substantial when you go to her website. Thank you, Anne, for taking the time to come on Psychedelics Today. I'm really happy that people will be able to learn about your work and your projects, and think a little bit more about this relationship angle that you've done some work with, I believe, in the conjoint therapy. So I think that's it for now. Again, thank you, Anne. And if you're interested in joining us to develop your professional track in the psychedelic landscape, come check out psychedeliceducationcenter.com. We've got some free classes there. We've also got some paid classes. If you really want to dig deep in your professional life and professional development, check out Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists. We've got a live 8-week program, probably starting again in March. The dates should be up by the time this airs. And we also have pre-recorded editions of that course. So no live class support, but you do have access to Slack and other students. There's also some more public facing, is that the right term? General audience. So, you're a festival enthusiast. You might not need to know about all the different therapies and approaches that some of these professionals take that we cover in the course. Probably don't need to know too much about the university studies. So this is a really great program too. And that's just, call it Navigating Psychedelics. So what is it? Lessons on self-care and integration, maybe. So you can find out about all that stuff over at psychedeliceducationcenter.com. If you want to find out what we're up to, sign up for our email list at psychedelicstoday.com, or come join the conversation over at our Facebook group at Psychedelics Today group on Facebook. We have well over 4,000 people there having great conversations daily. So check that out. If you want to support us with a small monthly donation over at Patreon, that would be lovely too. Check out patreon.com/psychedelics today and learn more about that there. Yeah, I think that's it for now. Enjoy this episode with Dr. Anne Wagner. All right, here we are again, Psychedelics Today. Dr. Anne Wagner, welcome.
Hi, thanks so much for having me, Joe.
I'm excited.
Me too.
So you are a clinical psychologist in Toronto at Remedy. I assume you've been kind of interested in this psychedelic topic for a bit. I'm kind of curious if you can give us a little bit about your background and how you might have got interested.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say I entered this world of first being exposed to anything related to psychedelics in 2013. So it's, I guess, been about 7, almost 8 years now. And at that point, I knew very little other than, what I'd maybe been exposed to in the media about psychedelics a little bit. At that point, what was happening in the research world was a lot quieter than what we see out in the media now. It's been amazing, the, total explosion of interest, both in popular media and in research and just, talking to my colleagues about it. So, but back in 2013, 2014, when we were first looking into this, it was totally outside the scope of anything that, we'd been looking at in the psych department that I was part of. So at that point, I was a postdoctoral fellow at Ryerson University, and I was working with my mentor, Candice Monson, who is a PTSD treatment development researcher. And so I just started this postdoc to do that, trauma treatment development. And one day, Candice invites me into our, regular meeting, and she asks if I might be interested in looking at this idea that had been proposed that we collaborate on, which was to combine MDMA with a treatment that she had developed called cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy, which is a couples treatment for PTSD. And part of what that entailed was, at the time, there was an active protocol open for therapists to have their own MDMA therapy experience. And so we were invited by the folks at MAPS, so Rick Doblin, Michael Mithoefer, Annie Mithoefer, to be participants in that study, to kind of to show us what it might be like to have an MDMA therapy session. And, at this point, I had zero understanding of what that might entail. And then, read the MAPS manual, had lots of conversations with Annie and Michael and Rick. And then we decided to go try, this is my scientific mind going like, this sounds like an interesting question to take a look at. And so went and had that therapeutic experience for myself, and was convinced in that moment that this is really, really worth pursuing. And it honestly shifted not only the course of my research, but of my career, my personal life, everything after that. And, not just because of that session itself, but just the growing interest in that direction. And since then, it's been a really interesting journey of doing that work. So we ended up doing that pilot study. It took several years to go from this, conception of an idea to execution of the idea to finally collecting all the data. And actually our final results for that study have just been accepted for publication. So we're really excited about that. And so we ran that study in 2016, 2017, that we saw 6 couples go through this protocol. And it was very compelling, like really, as someone who works with PTSD all the time in my clinical practice and many different trials over the years, it is the thing that's excited me the most as a clinician and a researcher. And I feel so much hope for the potential future clients who might get to access this. So, the results from that study were so compelling. Granted, it's only 6 couples, so right. We're, really, trying to temper expectations, but it's enough that it gave us a signal to say, we really want to look at this on a grander scale. So, we saw improvements in PTSD symptoms, and actually no PTSD diagnosis at the end in 5 of the 6 couples. And that's remarkable. Also, the level of engagement was so high. We didn't have any dropout from treatment, which is also you never find in clinical trials. And we saw improvements in relationship satisfaction, which was just fantastic to be able to see all of those things improving at the same time. So that was my gentle foray. And initially it started with just doing the study. It felt like, we were on an island kind of doing this work together. We literally were on an island. We were in South Carolina doing this work. And, initially feeling like I was in this cocoon of, fantastic intellectual stimulation and support. And then realizing that there was a whole world of people who are interested in this, and it's really been growing. And I think my true understanding of the scope of interest happened in 2017. And I had the chance to speak at the Psychedelic Science Conference in Oakland. And that was my first experience at a psychedelic conference. And I was just totally blown away. And I was really privileged to have the opportunity. I got to speak on the main stage and realizing like just how many people were there and cared about the work and saw the potential in it. And that was really exciting.
Right. For those who don't know, that stage was probably, I think, maybe 1,000 people. It could have even been more. It was an enormous room.
It was thus far probably the biggest crowd I've spoken to, which was really exciting.
Yeah. And what differences did you notice there from like, say, a standard psychology conference?
Oh, yeah, massive differences. I think one of the big things that really stuck out was the curiosity of the crowd. And it was a curiosity that was really innate. Like, people were just so interested in the topics that were being discussed. And you'd be hearing these fascinating conversations, in the hallways afterwards. And that was, my favorite part was I'd end up going for a coffee or a meal with just someone who would strike up conversation about their work or my work or whatnot. And it really felt like a meeting of the minds. And that felt incredibly invigorating. And the difference that you do find that intellectual conversation at psychology conferences too. However, it's steeped in more of the structures of psychology, if you will. So, you find the students there who are trying to figure out their next steps in their programs. You find it's not as curiosity driven, I find, which is an interesting thing to say, because you'd think that inherently that is the whole point of conferences, but it felt really different. It felt really open and conversational, and I loved it. And I think what's interesting now, we're seeing this, proliferation of psychedelic conferences, particularly online, at the moment during COVID, is I'm curious how that's going to shape what those conferences feel like when we're back in person, because now we're seeing a lot more interest from, commercial angles and ways that we can profit from this. And that feels very different from what that original experience I had at a psychedelic conference was around, which is really around growth and healing and curiosity and whatnot.
Right. No, I can totally sense that, right? Like, people, because this field has been kind of neglected for a number of decades, I think people are realizing how much work is left to do and how much interesting stuff in particular is left.
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe that's it. Given that we're also on the brink of a number of converging catastrophes, I think, having people hold out hope for psychedelics having a big impact too. It's hard to say if it's going to be the trick, but it could be.
I know. Yeah. I think it's a big question. And, one I'm hopeful for, and especially this idea of relational healing with psychedelics, which for me is really the impetus behind my work. What compels me is this idea that we can heal our relationships, right? Our relationships with ourselves, with our family, with our friends, with our loved ones. And that's so central to our feeling of well-being in our worlds, in our lives. And it's not just about psychiatric diagnoses. It's about how we function in those relationships and what that means for us. And I can see that being so important as we're in these bizarre times of sometimes we're spending way too much time with our loved ones right now, or we're spending no time with our loved ones, depending on, where you are in your living situation and what the pandemic's like in your corner of the world. And I hold a lot of hope I did before with, starting 6, 7, 8 years ago with this idea. And it's just growing now for me. And so I feel all the more compelled to keep going with that line of work.
So I love this idea of relational healing. Kind of curious if you can give us a little bit of insight into, maybe for the study, was it one individual in the relationship diagnosed with PTSD, or were there shared PTSD diagnoses, or how did that work?
Right. So for the pilot, we had one person was diagnosed with PTSD in the couple. And we did that for a number of reasons. I think, in the future, we might be able to look at two people having diagnoses, because we've certainly worked with that without the context of MDMA being there. But we started in this study with one person, and the relationship didn't have to be distressed, which is interesting, because even if people are saying like, yeah, I'm relatively happy in my relationship, at the end of the day, you're always going to be impacted if someone is struggling with, PTSD or something else in the relationship. So it's going to impact how that relationship functions. So that was the case for everybody, for sure.
Great. So like, are you seeing any other, like I'm not aware of any other kind of couples therapy projects going on.
Not to
Are
my
you?
knowledge. Yeah. No, I think we're certainly not the originators of the idea. Couple therapy with MDMA has been around since the existence of MDMA. So, Anne Shulgin was one of the first people to do couple therapy with MDMA after Sasha resynthesized it. And George Greer and Requia Tolbert, they were doing some couples-based work before MDMA was made illegal to use in therapeutic context. So it had been used in practice before, but there hadn't been a study that was only about couples with MDMA, and that was in this type of paradigm of research. So, to our knowledge, we're the first, first trial of couples therapy, and we have another one that will be hopefully happening or starting in 2021. That will be a larger study of the couples therapy with MDMA for PTSD. So we're really excited about that, and my hope is that after that, we'll have enough data to be able to show that it's safe and effective, not only for PTSD, but also for relationship satisfaction, so that we'd be able to try to run a study for couples who don't have a diagnosis, to have like a true couples therapy with MDMA study only. And so that would be really, really exciting for me as a next step.
Are there any kind of diagnoses for couples as like a single entity, or is it always kind of individual?
Yeah, that's interesting. It depends on kind of what, diagnostic nomenclature you're using in times.
Sure.
Yeah, sure. But within like let's say the DSM-5, which is what we would use for a lot of diagnoses. And of course it's got all of its issues. And I try to use as little diagnosis as possible, but sometimes it's necessary, especially for trials. But yeah, so within the DSM, there's really only one thing for couples, which is considered a V code, which isn't actually a diagnosis, but it's an indicator of distress. And there is a relational distress V code. So, that's potentially one area we were thinking that we might attempt. Like if we needed to have something that would be couples only and indicate distress, that would be it. But my thought is, I don't know that couples necessarily need to be distressed to go for couples therapy with MDMA, but we may need that.
That's one of the hardest parts of this whole thing, right?
Yeah.
Like we've got, PTSD, et cetera. Like we're going to heal like a good portion of those folks with this protocol, but like, what about everybody else who might not have a diagnosis? Like diagnoses are kind of expensive to come by sometimes. And
oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm hopeful, Joe, that this work will actually start, because the partner in all of these studies doesn't have a diagnosis of anything, or they might, but it isn't the thing we're focusing on. That we're actually going to be developing this fairly large amount of data that shows that it's safe and effective for folks who don't have diagnosis. So I don't know what we'll be able to do with that, but at least we'll have the data to show that there can be growth and change when that's the case. So perhaps that might pave the way for kind of broader application later, which would be great.
And are you using like a metric, like a scoring metric for stress in the relationship? Or...
Yeah. Mm-hmm. There's a couple of different measures that we use, including there's a couple satisfaction inventory and the quality of relationships inventory. There's a few different ways that we measure that, as well as using like interview and data from the actual sessions themselves, like coding of that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, that's great. And I hope more people want to do this. This is kind of a, like it was commonplace for a while.
Yeah.
Around Anne Shulgin and many others.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's kind of, and I know people, like, have you met any people that received that kind of therapy way back at this point?
Yeah, in passing, I've had, some lovely brief chats with folks about that. So I know it's been of interest and useful and beneficial for a lot of folks. And so I'd love it to be an opportunity that people have now to do that, especially in the times we're in.
Yeah, absolutely. So what do you see about kind of relational healing that might be overlooked relative to kind of like personal development? Someone as an individual going to therapy, like what do you see there that might be different?
Oh, that's a big question. I think we tend to, well, especially in North America, we tend to be really focused on this idea of personal optimization, right? This idea of how do we optimize ourselves, be our best selves, lead our best lives. And in reality, we're never going to exist in a vacuum. Like we don't exist as only ourselves. We are part of these ecosystems of the people close to us, our communities, where we live, and nature, like all of these things that make up our experience in the world. So if we're only looking at the level of the individual, or we're only healing or growing at the level of the individual, we're actually not necessarily going to see that shift or change or stick in a way that can be meaningful over time, because that's going to be not bringing along the rest of that person's world with them. And I think that that's a real possibility going forward, is this idea of being able to do it in connection and in community with the people around you. And I think a lot of our hurt in the world at the moment has to do with disconnection and isolation and othering, and this feeling of not having that oneness or connection with the people around us. So I think if we shift our perspective, that we actually can heal and grow in the context of a system, in the context of and when I say system, I mean a system of people, as opposed to, a system of government or anything, but a system of our loved ones, then that offers the chance for, the healing of our lineage. And there's, the sayings, the indigenous sayings that, when you do your healing work, it's not just for you, you actually healing for 7 generations before and 7 generations to come. And I think that's extremely powerful when we consider that, and the idea if we can be healing with others, that can impact that even more greatly.
So we've got some kind of mouse studies around trauma being passed down via, genetics or epigenetics or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, do you see that? Like, how do you like to model this kind of intergenerational trauma thing?
Yeah. I mean, as someone who's very much a psychosocial focused orientation, I see that, and we often talk about that more in the context of how you might have learned and therefore taken on, but in a subconscious way, some of these teachings, these learnings, and there is also the epigenetic component, but being able to work with it on an emotional, a cognitive, a behavioral, a spiritual level of going, interesting, how have I taken that in from, the people who've come before, my ancestors, and then how am I passing that on? What am I showing? What am I teaching? What am I, the ways in which I'm being around, kids or grandkids or nieces, nephews, what does that look like? And so I think there's a lot of different angles that we can see that play out, and it's given a lot of different names. But you can certainly see it from, even this concept of, we actually use this in our work of behavioral accommodation. And we use that specifically for PTSD, that the family system adapts to the needs of the person with PTSD to try to make life better for them and try to make it easier. But in fact, it actually keeps the cycle stuck of trauma symptoms, which is a fascinating dichotomy. Like, people think that they're supporting and they think they're doing what's right. So to keep everything calm and to keep the person with PTSD in a non-activated state. But if you're actually healing the PTSD, you need to break that system to shift it up. And that can feel really painful and difficult. And you can imagine if one person is doing that and the other person isn't on board, that could just feel like the person's triggering them constantly. And what do you mean? You're not going to do that anymore. Whereas like if both people are on board, then you're more able to create change for that dyad or that family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting concept. And I think I've seen that too. We try to like accommodate for people and it might make them feel worse. Like, why are you acting so weird?
Yeah.
For instance, or like, I don't want people to feel sorry for me.
Yeah. And it's really delicate because of course you want to make life smooth and easy for the people you love. And a lot of the time people are asking for accommodation in saying like, in subtle and not subtle ways, right? Like you think about keeping the house quiet if someone's really anxious or activated, right? And yeah, of course they want to keep it quiet. And at the same time, it's reinforcing that they can't handle if it's getting too loud. So it's an interesting balance because of course we want people to feel like they can ask for what they think they need in those moments, and understanding how it might be playing into the dynamic of the family.
Mm-hmm. Now, are these results published now?
So they're about to be published. Okay. So hopefully within the next month or so. But the results of the first case study were published in 2019. So those are available.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. Now let's kind of maybe get into Remedy a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
What are y'all doing at Remedy?
Yeah. So Remedy is a center for mental health innovation that I run here in Toronto. And the concept of Remedy is really an experiment of trying to create a home for research and practice that exists in a sustainable way. And so Remedy's been in existence for 2 years now. And I really developed the idea for it because I wanted there to be a home to do psychedelic research that could be sustainable over time and not fully reliant on either philanthropy dollars or grants, which is such it's amazing that we have philanthropic dollars coming in to fund the work. And it's amazing that there might be the possibility of grants. And at the same time, both of those structures end up creating the sense that only some work gets done. And the production of knowledge is sometimes held in, for example, only in universities or only in hospitals. And that actually limits who's able to produce that knowledge. And so a part of this idea came from the fact that I saw so many of my really talented colleagues, because they didn't want to go into full-time research jobs and tenure track positions, they stopped doing research. So they became clinicians, fabulous clinicians, but their wonderful ideas didn't get to go anywhere because there wasn't anywhere for them to do that work that would have been, supported and funded and whatnot. So that was my hope, was that, so the way Remedy is structured is the clinic itself, where we see clients and we do, all of our standard practice, we donate our profit to Remedy Institute, which is our not-for-profit, and that's where we conduct our research. And so that means that we're, over time, going to end up having this constant flow of support for innovation and research that will be there. And hopefully also that means we'll increase the ability for different voices to be involved in that research that maybe aren't included when it's only housed in universities and hospitals. And we're hopeful that will also be, eventually it will be a place where we're able to offer psychedelic assisted psychotherapy because, we'll have been doing it in the research context for a number of years by the time it's legalized. And so that's that in a nutshell, kind of what we're up to at Remedy. And it's been a really interesting journey so far. And we do a lot of psychedelic prep and integration for clients at the moment, while, the actual psychedelic assisted work is on the horizon.
Is ketamine assisted psychotherapy available in Canada?
It is. It's been available in the hospital context for decades. So, I have psychiatrist colleagues who have been using it in like inpatient contexts and hospitals. And there are some ketamine assisted clinics and people doing that work here. We at Remedy aren't doing ketamine assisted work, mostly because it's, it doesn't dovetail with some of the clinical interests that we have. And also,
Sure.
I find it's not the tool that I want to work with at the moment. So we haven't been going down that path.
Yeah. Cool. And have you seen anybody trying to start up cannabis assisted psychotherapy at all in Canada?
Oh, interesting. Yeah. I've heard about that, but I don't know of any like clinics that are doing that at the moment. I've heard of individual practitioners, but I haven't seen it myself.
Right on. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's pretty interesting, especially given that a prescription isn't always required.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. I hope more people look at it, but yeah, it's certainly very different from the other types of psychotherapy, like MDMA, for instance.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'll be very curious to see how that evolves over time. Yeah, right now, not hearing a lot about that here. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would love to run a study on it. Like, I know there's a few places doing it down here in Colorado, maybe even a bunch in California as well.
Cool.
Yeah, so it's happening, and hopefully we have data eventually. I know
Absolutely.
That's kind of required.
Yeah. Well, yeah, just even, for the knowledge of the provider, right? Of being able to have real consent with their clients, of going like, this is what we know about it. This is what we know works or doesn't, and for whom. And these are some of the risks. So just, in that whole informed consent process, the data is really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great point. Typically, I think, it's pretty safe already. We just kind of need that for the regulators so we don't go lose our licenses. But it's, there's a lot to this discussion for sure.
Totally. Yeah. And that's, as the clinician, that's often the hat I've got of going like, how do I describe that to the client? And like, because I end up having those really detailed informed consent conversations around psychotherapy, regardless, without any type of psychedelic or any other thing. So I would want as much data as possible to help that conversation along.
Yeah. Cool. Are there other people at your group who are very, really interested in this kind of relational healing concept?
Yeah, it's an interest of a number of us here at Remedy, and I have a number of students who are working with me as well, who are very interested in that topic, and then as well as our collaborators. So, the work continues on with Candice Monson and Annie and Michael Mithoefer. They continue to be my colleagues and collaborators on this relational healing with MDMA work. So that's really, really exciting.
That's great. So you're able to check in with Michael and Annie on a somewhat regular basis?
Yeah, exactly. I feel very fortunate to have them as mentors and friends. So I'm
people on the show might have heard this already, but our breathwork mentors, Lenny and Elizabeth Gibson in Vermont, actually used to facilitate breathwork with the Mithoefers quite a bit when they were in Vermont.
Amazing.
Yeah. So I think they were friendly for a while. I think Kyle might have actually studied with the Mithoefers as part of the MAPS training protocol.
Yeah, that would make a lot of sense. Absolutely.
Was your training part of the MAPS protocol, or did you do something different?
Yeah, so I did. Yes, it was part of the MAPS protocol, but it was at the very beginning of what is now their training program. So it was at the time when it was really just first starting to be developed. So,
right.
Yeah, so I got the opportunity I think I went to the very first training. We were already going on our study, but it was great to get to, have that first experience of watching all of their tape from their last study and meeting some folks who ended up being some of the phase 2 and phase 3 therapists who are now doing the MAPS trials. And so now over time, I've actually had the chance to attend, I think it's 4 different trainings. And then I'm actually one of the the trainers in training at the moment. So I'll be one of the MAPS trainers soon. Yeah. So it's fantastic. We just did one recently, and we have another one starting on Thursday that I'll be helping facilitate, which is fantastic. Yeah.
That's great. And is everything online right now?
It is. Yeah. So it's been really interesting trying to change or move what's an extremely experiential training onto an online format, because the way that, we like to train folks who are going to be doing this work is to essentially immerse people in video and in experience. So it ends up feeling like you are in an MDMA therapy session, because that's what you're going to be doing. You're going to be sitting and witnessing and being present for, up to 8 hours at a time. So, translating that online has been interesting, but thus far seems to be working. I really welcome the day when we'll get to do it in person again, but in the interim, I think it's working so far.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
And who are you working with? Is it Shannon?
Yeah. So, I've been assisting Michael and Annie. So they're the ones who are actually doing the trainings. And then, Shannon and Wes and Sarah and all the team who are doing the facilitation of that program. Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's excellent. And I'm glad to hear you're involved in the training. That's nice. And what year was your trip to South Carolina?
It was the first one where I had my own MDMA session was in 2014. So it was, March 2014. I remember distinctly. So forever
that's
an
awesome.
important time. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I bet. Well, that's kind of cool. So, do you see any new kind of frontier that like a young grad student might want to jump into? That's like really interesting and maybe slightly risky, but not so risky that you won't finish your degree?
Yeah, well, I think that's a good question, because that's probably all of my students right now who are going like, ooh, how do I do this? Honestly, the advice I really give to people is to try to be an expert in something, right? And it doesn't have to be psychedelics, though. And I think that's actually important, is like to get a real skill set in something that will support the work with psychedelics. So it could be that you are going to be a therapist. Fantastic. Become an amazing therapist. You could be a statistician. We're going to need those. Become an amazing statistician. Or like, we're going to need great lawyers, or great people who understand policy. All of these things. So I really believe in this model of become expert in a skill set and then apply it to psychedelics, because that way you're going to get the most impact in what you're doing, because you'll have this knowledge to back it up. So that's what I see right now. Is I actually work with a bunch of folks who, for example, are just really skilled psychologists who are now interested in bringing their skills into psychedelics, which is for me like a fantastic fit, because I can trust their research and clinical skills. And now it's, giving them new content. And as long as they're of the mindset that they're willing to do their own inner work, which I think is paramount if you're going to be doing this as a clinician, that would be a good fit for them. So I think that's one thing that perhaps gets, I don't think it gets ignored, but I think is worth highlighting, is that, when you're sitting with folks who are going into non-ordinary states and are going into a lot of shadow work, it's going to bring up stuff for the clinician. And it's one thing, if you're seeing someone an hour a week, you can easily digest that and move along and, talk it out with colleagues or move through it. Versus when you're deeply in process with someone who's going through psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, you're with them for 8 hours and an entire weekend. And you don't have that same space to be able to work it through. So unless you're engaged in your own personal understanding and process, I think that's potentially a real challenge, or will be a real challenge for folks who are doing this work. And as of right now, there's only been, a handful of people who have been doing the trials. And I think that's been at the forefront of people's minds. But as this gets bigger, we're training more people. It's going to be hopefully more widely available. I just want to emphasize that I think to do it well, you need to do your own reflection too. So,
yeah, that's a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Like for whatever reason, when psychedelics are in the mix, stuff seems to be a lot more two-way.
Mm.
um,
Yeah.
and yeah, like how do you get those skills? And it's, yeah, I think through a lot of inner work. It's kind of obnoxious to have to go through all that work to do, these sessions, but that's what it requires, unfortunately. And I think people are like, oh, I don't need to do that. And it's like, well, listen to people who've been around for a little while. They've seen a lot that you have not seen.
Yeah, exactly. And I think listening to the folks who've been doing this for many years and who were doing this work before it became illegal, like it is so important to listen to their experiences, heed their warnings, all of those pieces, because, we'll end up in really challenging dynamic situations with folks if we don't. And even so, we'll end up in those positions anyway, but we need to be, I think it's good if we're aware that they're coming and that we need to have done our own inner reflection to figure that out beforehand.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of hard to explain what this looks like when it gets really messy.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, like the rapport can at times go like way off the rails, like in both directions almost. Mm-hmm. And what else? Like, oh, cool, you're here to really save me from, hell or whatever is going on. There's just so much complicated stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're very right about that.
People are really careful with their training most of the time.
Well, and that's what we're trying to really emphasize with the trainings that we're doing, and that I try to emphasize with my team and anyone that who's interested in doing this, of going, this isn't, it can't just be because you're interested. It's like, this is a real depth commitment to try to do this in a good way. So it necessitates understanding that like all, the therapeutic processes that we learn about, like, oh, there's going to be transference and countertransference. That's like, it's like 1,000-fold when you're doing this work, because it's going to come up.
It's actually there.
Oh, wow.
It's like you can feel it in the room kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like next level of what you may have encountered before. And so it's just, it's going to require a lot of skill and a lot of thoughtfulness, and which I think is totally possible. And it's just making sure people know.
So there's, so you live in Toronto, which is now becoming quite the psychedelic hotspot. I'm sure you've noticed.
Yeah.
And, there's now psychedelic companies on the stock market from Toronto, and like all sorts of wild stuff going on.
Uh-huh.
And Remedy is trying to take a different approach than just like, money. Can you speak about how the approach at Remedy might be different from what people would expect from a psychedelic business, I guess, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, I think it's a good way of framing it. Like we're not that. I think, first and foremost, we're a psychology practice and a research practice. So that's in essence very different than a public business that, is publicly traded, et cetera. So we're, when you run a psychology practice, a mental health practice, it's extremely regulated in terms of what you can do, the concept of what you can do. And so that's important, I think, for us to always hold to, of like the ethic of that. And then beyond that, when we're talking about the research and the innovation piece, that's really our focus, is creating the space for people to ask questions, do research, be creative in how we're doing that, be in a really supportive community of like-minded individuals who are always hoping to do differently, to do better in a way that is equitable, in a way that's supportive of both the clients and the staff here. So I think the difference for us is, the type of knowledge that we will produce, we're very much invested in an open science framework. Like there would never be, we're not doing any, pharma development of anything. We're really curious about how do we develop, treatments and interventions that will help people with growth? And so we're looking at it more from the psychological perspective of how do we do this, and in a way that will be hopefully just freely available, and our intent is to be forwarding almost like the mission of the psychedelic itself, as opposed to, the profit that could come from that. So, yeah.
Right. Well, that's awesome.
Thanks.
How many people are at Remedy?
Yeah. So I think our whole team there's about 24 of us right now. So we've grown a lot in the past 2 years. We started off with a very small team, and we've got, and that's not just clinicians, that's also folks who are involved in the research side and operations. So we've got a really wonderful team that all bring, intersecting but different perspectives and, different therapeutic modalities. And I feel lucky to work with a really, really talented and thoughtful group of people.
What is your, so this probably a goofy question, but what's your kind of like primary orientation? Are you coming from like a CBT lens, or what kind of worldview in terms of like, I know it's a really hard question.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, because it's evolved and changed over time. So, my primary training when I was in grad school was in cognitive behavioral work. But since then, I've really delved deeply into several different other modalities. So, the first one that I started to really connect with was mindfulness-based work. So, that was really important as a meditator, but just I use that a lot with clients now, and we're working on a protocol actually to combine mindfulness-based cognitive therapy with psilocybin. So we're hopeful that will happen in the next little while. Yeah. So there's that one, and then also through my psychedelic work, I've done a lot more learning and growth in kind of depth psychology, transpersonal components, bringing in more emotion focused and somatic work as well. So I would say that I don't practice those particular modalities as a primary focus, but they're certainly informing the work I'm doing. So it's interesting, as someone who came from and believe very much in evidence-based work, here I am, practicing very much as an integrative psychologist, which is great because I'm using components that are best suited and have the best evidence for the particular thing that we're looking at. So, yeah.
Well, that's awesome. Yeah. And it's a complicated discussion. Saying, oh, I'm interested in transpersonal psychology. I think that could be a death sentence in some universities.
Yeah. Or there's not a lot of teaching about it. I mean, I hadn't ever heard of it until I started doing the psychedelic work, which was interesting.
Yeah. I encountered it in 2001 as part of my undergrad. Just assigned reading in a philosophy class. And it was,
wow.
Yeah. Just some book led me at 2001 to Stan Grof's work. And I was like, what? You guys are not lying to me? This is supposed to be the truth? All right.
Well, and I love that it was in a philosophy class too, right?
Yeah.
Like that was your entry point to it, as opposed to, another type of...
Yeah, right. Like it has to be in philosophy because, like, can you really comfortably teach this in a field that's struggling? Like I think psychology in relation to a lot of other of the sciences has a really hard time. And we don't really want to admit that, like people in the field, because it's devaluing what we do, but it's like, we've got kind of a lot of work to do I think, evolve the field, and people shouldn't try to like bury that.
Oh, I agree 100% with that. And it's, the loss I think we have when we're trying to, only position psychology as a science, right? Which I think happens a lot when people are, I don't know I think it probably comes from this, well, we need to be seen as credible as, psychiatry or another
that's exactly
discipline.
Or
right?
I would say more like math, like psychology and psychiatry. But, yes, absolutely. Like physics, like we want to be as hardcore as like the hardest of the sciences.
Exactly. It's like, I feel like everyone's just yelling, we're scientists. It's like, well, of course you can be a scientist, and you can't ignore some of the art that goes alongside of that, or like the way of understanding that knowledge doesn't only come from this particular, way of producing it, or this particular way of understanding it, that the scientific method is wonderful and valid in a lot of ways. And then for some questions and some answers, that's not the way to go about finding it. So right. I think it's interesting. I hope one day I hope we're moving towards this idea that psychology doesn't have to have this ego issue around the fact that it needs to only be, quantitative methods and needs to stake its claim as a science all the time, because it is one, and it's just got to get comfy in that.
Right. And perhaps psychology is the point at which this kind of, I'll use the overused term, where this like paradigm shift is coming from, or could enter into the rest of reality, because there are ample, examples of things that bend the rules.
Definitely.
And yeah, like the things that got me really interested were Stan Grof kind of talking about something that looked like The Exorcist or Poltergeist in that book. And I'm like, what? You guys want me to believe this? And then I kept digging in, and it turns out there was endless stories like it.
Definitely.
And,
yeah.
What does that mean when you can somewhat kind of at least reproduce weirdness, if it's not at least like a firm result?
Mm-hmm. Or like if you don't get the description of that, like you lose the essence of what that actually looks like, right? Like imagine if we didn't have like Stan's descriptions of what happened, right? If it was only data points, we wouldn't understand.
It becomes soulless.
Yeah, exactly.
Like why are people still reading Freud and Jung? I think it's because they were like really great writers too. And they had a lot of, sure they had problems, but they also had a lot of heart, I think, for at least a period of time.
For sure. Yeah. Right. And people get on board with this concept, right? Of like an archetype, right? Like we can wrap our heads in our imaginations around what that looks like, which you need that to capture the attention and interest of a wider group of people. And I think that's really powerful. Yeah. It's interesting. There's actually something, clanging for me around this idea of just, what we privilege in terms of, quote unquote, hard science, or the balance around that. And I've even just been thinking about it recently when we're thinking about, study designs, and, we're trying to think through some study design for this next large couples therapy study. And the idea that right now everything's focused on the drug, right? That it's this kind of pharma model of, is it the drug or the placebo, right? Which one has more effect? When really, I think the question needs to be like, should it be the therapy or the therapy plus the drug, right? So that's actually in essence a different question. So we're not like privileging the medicine, and we're not privileging the kind of hard science around, is it the chemical or not, the absence of chemical? And like, actually, is it the process or the process amplified? So it's, it may not directly correlate to what we were talking about, but it resonated for me of being like, interesting. We see it in it really bleeds into all areas when we're thinking about, what's valid and what's a valid question, and from what perspective. And, as a psychologist, my question is really, hey, is it the therapy, or is it the therapy plus the psychedelic? And yeah.
The question I have to like further that is, how do we control or examine what it is about the therapist coming into that equation?
Oh, big one.
Like as an individual, like, I could do it and I could be horrible, and then you could do it and be wonderful. And perhaps we're running through the same process theoretically.
Yeah.
but clearly I'm missing things that you're doing. So like, how do we control for that? Like that seems to be a really hard question.
Yeah. There's lots of different ways that we've tried to think about that in the field over time. Like we talk about like therapist effects, right? Or, and it's interesting because in trials, what we do is you limit the number of therapists. So if your number of participants is big enough, you can actually subdivide by therapist and see, does does this therapist group of people do better or worse than this therapist group of people, right? And you can kind of take it from there. But, and some findings will show that as long as the content is there, it doesn't matter what the interaction's like. But actually, most of the data suggests that the alliance is extremely important in outcomes of any type of psychology or any type of therapy. So yeah, I know it's interesting because we spend so much time training as therapists to pay attention to that, but it's also like, how do you actually shape that and evaluate that?
And it's a really hard truth. Like someone might be better than somebody else. Like that's uncomfortable.
Yeah. And I think accurate. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, I would just encourage people to have those difficult thoughts, even though it's kind of going against the grain. Like we've got to control for all these variables. And yeah, I like that limiting the number of therapist teams is part of the program for y'all. Yeah,
exactly. So at least we're not introducing like all of this variance with all kinds of different folks. But yeah, it is a difficult and uncomfortable question, but I think one that's incredibly important, like especially as we're shaping folks to do this work, is it does require warmth and an ability to be really present with people. And I think people take that as a given, and people, generally speaking, people who are interested in doing this work or being therapists in general probably have higher than normal, amounts of those things, but not everybody. So it's important to note.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe, is there anything left on the relational topic before I kind of jump to something different that you might want to point out?
Yeah, I mean, I think we touched on a lot of it. I do feel like it's the way, I mean, I'm probably biased here, but I think it's like the way of the future when we're thinking about all of, societally, how we might shift, how we might, the idea that we've had so much isolation at the moment, that the idea of being able to be together in community is going to be just wildly amazing post-pandemic. And that I think being able to do things relationally, like either dyadic work, with couples or in groups, and being able to use those interactions as ways to heal, to grow, to investigate is going to be really powerful. And people will probably feel that difference all the more acutely after what we've just, globally been through.
Right. I like how you're putting it in the rear view.
Yeah.
Nice.
Optimism here. Yeah.
So when SARS happened, I forget when that was, like 6, 7, 8, it was a lot of years ago.
Yeah.
And there was an enormous spike in PTSD cases. And that was only 2 months?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm kind of curious if you're like hopeful for advancing access to MDMA, maybe in like an accelerated fashion therapeutically, based on the increased need and, the Canadian healthcare system being overwhelmed, or,
right.
I think plenty of, I think the healthcare system's already overwhelmed. So
yeah, completely. Yeah. I mean, we're anticipating that there's going to be a large spike in cases in the next little, once it calms down. We're in that phase right now where it's still ongoing. So in a lot of ways, it's, we'd call it peri-traumatic for people because they're technically still in the situation. So you're less likely to see trauma symptoms when you're still in the situation, but you might later.
Right.
So, that being said, we're already seeing, and have been for months, an uptick in people's trying to access care and mental health care in general. So I think that's, a good sign that people are reaching out, but also B, showing us that there's going to be a massive need. And there already is a massive need, because the number of people who reach out is only scratching the surface of the number of people who actually need care. So, I think that's an interesting question in terms of kind of expediting access to this type of treatment post-pandemic. Given that we've had some cases that have been approved here in Canada recently through Therasil for compassionate use for, so psilocybin being used for end-of-life anxiety. I wonder if we might be able to use that pathway in terms of compassionate care options. But given that that's a case-by-case basis, I don't know that would actually meet the need or the demand. I'm also a big fan of that MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD is kind of the most intensive treatment, if you think about it, right? That there's a whole continuum of intensities of treatments that people could access, and that I like this to be one that is available and that people would be able to choose to have, but also they may not need that amount of intensity, right? So I've been working on some online interventions that are, both, self-guided and also, coach assisted for PTSD that are kind of the light touch interventions that might be applicable for a lot of people who are suffering. So I think we're going to see the need for this range being available in the future.
That's great. Yeah, the Therasil thing is amazing, but yeah, having the government as the bottleneck is really complicated.
Right.
But it seems like public support for that project is really amazing.
Yeah, from what I've been able to witness and see and in conversation, definitely. Yeah, and then it was great to see that it feels like Health Canada responds to data, right, which is fantastic. So
yeah, it's a great contrast to the States. I love also that they seem to have partnered with some folks from the Groff Foundation. Groff Legacy Training, I think it is.
Yes.
And I'm just really happy to see that, the Groff world's getting included. It's always kind of been included because Rick was one of the first students. To go through holotropic breathwork training. So it's like, it's just not on the nose that Groff was kind of like that forward.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I can't speak highly enough about holotropic breathwork. I got introduced to it by Michael and Annie, when I was started doing this work with them. And, we did some breathwork in some of the earliest MDMA therapist training modules. And I just find it such an amazing tool to do this work and to do it in a legal way, which is so fantastic to be able to do that. And, prior to COVID, we used to host holotropic breathwork here at Remedy. And that was just an amazing offering to be able to have for the community. So looking forward to when we're able to do that again.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, it's one of the things I like to do most is host breathwork workshops. And it's looking like I'm probably not going to be hosting a normal size group until like 2022, unless things really change. So it's like,
I know.
Okay, I guess I can wait.
I know. I just had that moment today too. I got an email from this meditation community that I've done retreats with, and they've announced that there are no in-person retreats in 2021. I'm like, okay. So I'm like, oh, here we are. Yep.
Like, as painful as it is, it's important. Like I'm seeing folks getting tied into meditation retreats, and I'm pretty uncomfortable by that. And I'm still seeing people do ayahuasca in groups.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's pretty irresponsible, everybody. Like, why is your development more important than someone's life,
Yeah. And I think especially right now, as we're in this next wave, right? Our case count here in Ontario is higher. Like, our daily rate is higher than it ever was in the first wave. And, I think people forget that it's really deadly, and it's, we need to be cautious of that and protect those who are most at risk. Mm-hmm.
Right. Mm-hmm. All right. So we're at about an hour. I'm curious if there was any other topic we might want to hit before we wrap up.
Well, I mean, I think we've talked about a lot of what we decided we were going to talk about. So yeah, I'm feeling pretty good at the moment.
Awesome. And Where can people find Remedy or your website?
Yeah, the best way to find us is our website, which is Remedy Center, spelled the Canadian way, TRE.ca. And we have Instagram and Twitter, which you can link to from the website.
Great. And do you take international clients at all?
We do not. So as of right now, we only are working with folks who are in Ontario, given our restrictions here with our licenses. So so we work with people in Ontario. Yeah.
All right, great. All right. Well, I think that's it for now. I really appreciate you coming on the show, and I want to stay in touch with you about any exciting developments going on in Remedy. So
absolutely.
Look forward to connecting more.
Yes, you too. Thanks so much, Joe.
And there you have it. Dr. Ann Wagner, Remedy Center, CA. Check it out. What did you think? Let us know. Shoot us an email over at psychedelicstodayemail@gmail.com or hit us up on socials. We're all over the place. We've got a big Facebook group. Just go to Facebook, look up Psychedelics Today group, and join the conversation. And again, we've got educational offerings over at psychedeliceducationcenter.com. So please check that out and see if there's anything you love there. All right. I think that's it for now, everybody. This is Joe Moore signing off for Psychedelics Today. We'll see you next time.